afternoon, all. Welcome to the Christmas School of Public and International Affairs. I am Annie Janot. I am the dean of the school, and I'm so happy to see all of you here today for this latest installment of our Constructive Dialogue series. We began Constructive Dialogues to model for our students the benefits and the necessity of civil discourse in policymaking. The diverse backgrounds and perspectives of our guests match those that students will encounter when they graduate and either begin or continue their careers in public service. It is important for all of us to appreciate our common humanity and understand the value of differences. Our guests today bring distinct perspectives to education policy. Each served as an Assistant Secretary of Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development in the U.S. Department of Education, one in the Biden administration and one in the first Trump administration. We are fortunate to have the chance to hear their very true federal education policy at this most pivotal moment, with President Trump signing an executive order last year calling for the dismantling of the Department of Education. Jim Blue served under Education Secretary in the first Trump White House, and prior to that, he worked in education reform at state level for more than 20 years. Among other leadership roles, he was the national president of the Students First and the national director of the Alliance for School Choice. He also helped guide the education reform investments of the Walton Family Foundation, and more recently, Jim co-founded the Defense of Freedom Institute, a nonprofit that promotes education, freedom, civil rights, and a limited federal role in education and workforce development. He's also president of DFI Action, a separate entity that focuses on federal lobbying. That'd be an easier way to do this, but here we go. Roberto Rodríguez served under Education Secretary Miguel Cardona in the Biden administration. Previously, as Deputy Assistant to the President for Domestic Policy, he shaped President Barack Obama's education agenda and served as a key architect of major bipartisan initiatives. Roberto began his federal service as chief counsel to Senator Edward Kennedy on the Senate Health Committee. He started his career at Unidos, where he supported legislative policy and advocacy to improve educational access, equity, and community empowerment, and also served as president and CEO of Teach Plus, advancing a national movement to elevate the voices and vision of talented educators to improve education policy and practice. A few brief reminders before we begin. Please listen carefully and respectfully and with an open mind. Remain calm and curious, and if you're inclined to engage with our speakers, please ask questions and don't give speeches. Challenge ideas and not people. Allow space for other voices, and please give our speakers the courtesy of your undivided attention. Thank you to Jim Blue and Roberto Rodríguez for joining us, and to everyone in attendance for today's event, which is made possible by the Rawson 66 Distinguished Visitor Fund. Thanks as well to our very own Jennifer Jennings, the class of 1988 Professor of Domestic Policy and Professor of Sociology and Public Affairs, and the Director of SPIA's Education Research Section, who will moderate this afternoon. Thank you so much, Jen. The floor is yours. Okay.
It's such a treat to see so many different parts of the education community here today. So we're gonna just get us started, given that how many students we have in the room. We can talk about how y'all got into public service. So you all could have done anything, and you chose very distinctively to stay in public service and public advocacy throughout your career. So maybe you could just tell our audience a little bit about how you got there.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jen. It's thank you so much for inviting us and for having this conversation. Thank you, Dean, for having us here. I'm really thrilled to have the opportunity to be with my friend Jim and to talk a little bit more about education policy. It's something I'm really passionate about. You know, I wasn't always passionate about education policy, but I was always passionate about education. So I think that's kind of, you know, growing up, I was son of public school educators. I grew up in Michigan, spent a lot of time in and around schools and in the back of boardrooms. And I think some of that really just kind of sunk in for me. It really was an animating force for thinking about a career in public service. I did, when I moved to DC, as Dean mentioned, I worked at a national civil rights organization, actually on education practice work with local communities, with parents, with other multi-service providers and leaders. So I almost kind of fell into public service accidentally in some of that work, but I've had the real opportunity to be around wonderful mentors and leaders from Senator Kennedy all the way through Barack Obama, and of course in this most recent administration. And you know, for me, it's been the place where I can enjoy my passion for how to drive equity and improve opportunities for families with the system level change that I think our country needs to make that happen for all students.
So let me start with some thank yous. I have to thank you for even having this kind of forum. I very much appreciate CFA. The people who made sure I got here today, they moved, they moved the airlines, which is hard to do. As a result, I haven't had enough sleep, and so I'm probably going to give too much information here to answer your question around public service. But I think it's helpful for all of us to sort of understand who we are and where we're coming from. And I just want to acknowledge that from an early age, I wanted to do public service because I was angry about the way the world was working. I was particularly concerned about what happens to our low-income communities in the United States and actually around. And so that's really what's driven me. My dad was also a public school teacher. He actually left corporate life to become a history teacher. He was a high school in Los Angeles with the lowest graduation rates. You understand what I was referring to there. So his part of my family to do public service, having watched him, I was never going to go into education. Right? There is that life is a very hard one. I saw it up front, and I didn't think I'd end up here. So there are twists and turns that got me here today, but that's the underlying emotion behind your question.
Thank you all for both sharing that with us. I'm gonna just dive into an easy question now. It's important to me. This big thing, American education today. Where might you go with that? And why choose that one over everything else? And you're more than welcome to speak about the question. I'll take it in a different direction.
Well, look, I think I'll start this one because you'll hear a lot of areas of agreement between my friend Roberto and me, although we have worked toward different solutions. But we are very concerned with the lack of academic achievement in our low-income community. If you are familiar with the National Assessment of Educational Progress, you can give the exact numbers. But it turns out that about 30%, 33% of our students are not even scoring basic level, and they cannot read the basic text grade level. When the test was originally created, they sort of imagined that maybe 40% of people would be basic. And then they realized they better create this below basic category. And now we have this huge group that's not learning to read, that's not learning to do math, and that is set on a life trajectory that is really quite scary for them, for the country. And that is the issue that I think that drives me every day. And you probably have more to say about this. But
yeah, I think, Jim knows I worry about this as well. It's an area of agreement here. And, it's the underachievement that we're seeing around the country. One of the things, just on top of Jim's comments, we were at a time in the 1990s making progress. We actually were seeing achievement go up. We were seeing the achievement gaps between our low-income students and their more affluent peers beginning to narrow. And in the last couple of years, and part of this is the pandemic, but this was happening even prior to the pandemic. We've seen a backsliding in reading and math attainment. So the big question is, and you take that underachievement alongside big changes that are happening in education today, like the advent of ed tech and AI, in the lives and in the learning of our students. Like the demands of an innovation economy that look very different than when our high schools were first designed in an industrial era, for instance. So, I think the need of for economic competitiveness and our lack of bringing an evidence base to bear to meet the challenge from an achievement perspective are the things that I'm most worried about. And I think one of the big challenges that we have, to your question, Jen, is like we don't have the right mechanisms in place yet to drive the evidence base down to the local level to make sure that regardless of the zip code in which our kids are learning and living, that their school is able to implement evidence-based practices work. And we are bad at scaling innovation. If we keep on the course without the new solutions and ideas that are being brought into education, we won't get different results. So we need a better aperture to scale innovation in our country in education.
Just to put a point on some of those things with respect to the NAEP data, that a lot of the changes that have really happened post 2015 have come from kids at the bottom of the distribution, 10th percentile, the 25th percentile, and even the 50th, like really, taking a hit, but especially to hit the very bottom. And so, with that in mind, I'm interested to know, is there kind of one thing that you think that, given you both established the same set of goals, right? Achievement, which is rare to hear these days, quite frankly. You hear a lot more about parental satisfaction than you do about the food. Is there one thing that you think the other side gets right about education policy that we plausibly could come together to push forward some collective action?
Good question.
Yeah.
I think the focus on making sure that, I'm sympathetic to some of the focus on choice and on making sure that parents have a strong role in education and helping our students be able to get ahead. I think that's one thing that the other side talks about, and I think we can do better to provide a more meaningful opportunity for our parents to play a stronger role in our kids' education. There was a time, I think Jim and I both remember, there was a time when there was a strong bipartisan resolve. I'm thinking back to when I worked on No Child Left Behind, which was in 2001 and 2002, years ago. But there was a strong bipartisan resolve to closing the achievement gap. So I have faith that we can potentially get back to that, but it's going to require a bigger focus and a stronger, I think, awareness of the economic implications if we continue down the course that we're going down now.
So one of the things Roberto mentioned is the need to have more innovation in our system. I have a different analysis systemically of the issues here, and I really lean into giving parents the power to choose the best school for their children, that they decide. And as most of you know, most school assignment is done by the zone you live in, your zip code. And as a result, we have watched one party, the Republican Party, embrace education freedom, parent choice, a lot more ability for new entrants to come into the market to say, I have a better answer. And that's what I think is a better solution for innovation than trying to have the federal government fund experiments around. This is an area of disagreement. I do also want to say, though, that the role of the federal government is a separate question in all of that. And I'll let you come, we can discuss this one later, but there are things the federal government can do well to encourage choice, competition, innovation, and other things that they simply can't do because of A, it's a government monopoly, and B, it's very partisan in Washington, D.C. The other point I would have made I thought we had an agreement, a bipartisan agreement around a form of choice. Public school choice, the use of charter schools. And, you know, charter schools have been the most effective reform our country has seen. And it became partisan. The Democratic Party in particular has turned against it because of the teacher unions. And that has blown apart one of the very few areas in K-12 where we had bipartisan. And I long to get back to that, but I also understand politics, and I don't think it's gonna happen.
So, with respect to you kind of foreshadowed there, Jim, the federal government role. And one of the things we talk a lot about in our classes here is kind of the unique role the federal government has played in, enforcing civil rights and ensuring that there's funding going to the lowest performing kids. So historically, states haven't necessarily been at the forefront of stepping up to do those things. And please contradict me if you disagree. I'm interested to know how each of you thinks about the federal role in this moment, and what ideally, it would be.
I'll start. So there is no doubt that the federal government still has to play a role in civil rights enforcement. In just a little history here, that is the result of egregious behavior on part of this, I would say, a handful of states, but actually a broad swath of states across the country, where Congress finally said, we need to step in, even though we are the federal government, to help police what's happening in local communities across the country. There is a trade-off here, and I'll be talking about policy trade-offs all the time. And that is that our civil rights mechanisms can get captured. This is a concept I hope you all understand. And they can get captured by radical extremist components of a party. And that can lead to interpreting our civil rights laws in a way that is just way outside of the mainstream of most Americans. And you can have blowback. I think that's what we watched in the last election. You may remember the she cares about they, them, and not you series of ads. And that is because of a peculiar analysis of Title IX that allowed people to say, oh, it's not about sex. It's now about gender, which is a much broader category. And that led to behavior down at the local level that was actually offensive to many Americans. And so, while I believe it needs to happen, I also think there needs to be guardrails. So this is just clarity from Congress to say, here's what we mean by our civil rights laws, and Congress has difficulty reaching its own consensus, again, because of the partisan debates. But so where I stand, that is absolutely going to be necessary. The second part of the question is, well, where should it be? I don't think it needs to be at the Department of Education. Everything else in civil rights is done through the Department of Justice. And I think the Department of Justice can handle it for our schools and colleges, as well as Parliament.
Yeah, and I would just, my reflections on the importance of the federal role in government, I think there are two kind of critical roles here. One is for the federal government and the Department of Education to be helping and a partner with state and local communities in advancing educational opportunity and improving the competitiveness for our students to be able to succeed in life. And that's at the heart, that's part of the mission of the U.S. Department of Education when it was founded 42 years ago, as the only cabinet agency that focuses on the educational opportunity and well-being of our students and grounds itself in economic competitiveness. So, there have been a lot of debates around the effectiveness of the federal government and the agency in that effort. But I think what we're seeing today with the diminishment of the Department of Education, I worry about our ability to turn the corner on some of our grand challenges in education, whether it's underachievement, whether it's thinking about using technology more effectively, whether it's thinking about helping more of our students get to and through higher education, whether it's being that partner and renewing that compact with our colleges and universities to be, the beacons of learning and some of the most important places where knowledge, research, and solutions to our country's future is being cultivated. And I think you need to have a federal Department of Education to move that forward. We can debate around what that might look like. But the second important element is one that Jim mentioned around civil rights and enforcing our civil rights laws. Title IX, Title VI, all. And there, you won't be surprised we disagree with kind of where the civil rights enforcement has gone. I would say we are in a radical moment right now in how this current administration is enforcing its civil rights laws to, try to direct local communities, school districts, and classrooms to teach or to remove references around diversity, equity, and inclusion that they argue violate civil rights law. I think that's a stretch in terms of if you look at what civil rights law looks like, and we've never had an administration that's trying to actually dictate what type of curriculum or affinity organizations or groups look like in their schools on the basis of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I worry about that, right? I think the pendulum is swinging there, and those civil rights laws are being used in ways that I think ultimately might strip opportunity from kids who need them. But that's an important the Office of Civil Rights and the work that they do to uphold those laws in our higher education institutions, in our K-12 institutions, I think is a critically important function of the department.
So I think it's worth talking about this kind of issue. What that means, I can just speak loudly because I teach in this room. No, not the. Just try again. Okay. Oh.
It'll be a little bit to your. Yeah, might be.
Okay.
The microphone.
So much. So, schools are on the receiving end of lots of social change. I'll be talking about this in my teaching staff this morning that we think about things like when we talk about education policy around immigration, what the border policy should be is not the question that we ask. We ask what kids' experiences are in school. By the same token, you both brought up the issue of kind of gender and sex. So for the cohorts that are in high school, based on national data, that right now, 25% of those kids identify as LGBTQ.
Right.
About 5% overall, maybe 4 to 5, identify as trans. Those are the facts on the ground. And so I'm wondering how we think about that question, given that there certainly is political disagreement around how to handle this issue, who should handle it, what role parents should play, what role schools should play, etc. I figure it's in sort of modeling how to have debate across lines. We might as well just go there.
Well, I mean, the first thing I'd say is I feel like, our schools are so many ways one of our original democratic institutions, right? So, they continue to be our centers of our community, but they are places where, the civic life, the social life, the fabric of our communities is played out. And so when we talk about immigration, or we talk about, issues that you mentioned around gender identity, or we talk about other issues around housing or food insecurity, transportation, all of those issues play out in the lives of young people, in the lives of our students, and in their families. And so I wouldn't argue that schools have to solve all of that, but I would argue that we do need laws and policies and systems in place that support the learning for all of our students, and that are, really taking into account some of those issues. So immigration is a perfect example of that, right? Like you look, this is settled law in Plyler versus Doe from the Supreme Court, that undocumented students should have a right to be able to be educated in our public education system. That's being called into question by some now, but schools have wrestled with this and settled, and the Supreme Court has settled on the policy of we need to be a welcoming environment for all of our students, including our students who are our immigrant students. Now, I worry about what we're seeing around the country with respect, and this is not an immigration panel, so we have to get into all of those issues, but I do worry about what we're seeing with respect to the current enforcement regime around immigration and how that's playing out for our students, for their social and emotional well-being, for their mental health, not just for our students whose parents or whose family members might be threatened, but for students who are learning alongside those students, who are part of that community. I also worry for our students who have been marginalized or for whom access has been denied in public education, and for whom enforcement and full enforcement of civil rights laws is critical for them having a seat at the table, right? For being able to live in an inclusive environment and learn in an inclusive environment where their identity isn't being threatened, where they're able to participate fully in their education just as other kids are, right? And so for a lot of our LGBTQ students, for a lot of our trans students whom I have sat with, and heard from, this is why you saw such a vigorous enforcement of our civil rights laws during the Biden administration with respect to those students, because all means all. And like every student, whether you're a student with a disability, whether you're a student who's an English learner, whether you are a student who's a trans student, you should have full access to your education. And our civil rights laws were hard fought to deliver that, and it's our job to guarantee that.
So let's just tackle one at a time.
Yeah.
If I were with the administration, I would say, well, talking about immigration is above my grade level. That's what we do. We don't want to talk about something. But I think there's still a lot of truth there. What I would hope is that the current administration understands these trade. There are a lot of people right now arguing within the administration that Tyler is most this. I guess I haven't had enough sleep, but that there are problems with how that decision came down, and they went. And here's the trade-off. I'm Southern California, grew up in a very diverse community, friends, staff, DACA and their brothers and sisters were citizens. I had friends who were just undocumented immigrants. And so I come at this issue a lot differently. And what I hope people recognize is if you reverse Plyler, you've created a situation where you are allowed to discriminate based on immigration status. And I don't know what happens to those children in a place like Los Angeles, where 70% of the population is Hispanic. So a large portion is probably illegal. And so those children are now on the streets. What does that mean for our society? So those kinds of things I hope everybody is thinking. Similarly with LGBTQ issues. There are people in my life who I love who transition. I'm very aware of all the issues that go into that. And I think parent rights need to be respected. It's an issue you raised. There has been across the country a lot of social transitioning and not talking to the parents about it. And to me, that is a violation of what a family's role. Now I get the other side of it, where those children are subject to violence and stuff, and I think that's an assumption we should be challenging, because I think most families are actually loving. There are probably examples where you would have to worry to manage those examples rather than create a policy you don't tell parents. the new transition.
Okay, so.
I did that without a mic. Did anybody hear anything?
Absolutely. I think the online folks are the question. Let's go back to the issue of choice, and how that intersects with achievement. So I think one of the most fascinating things of coming up in the world during an NCLB, accountability era, we all agreed on achievement as a central issue, and moving into an era where the norm is focused to kind of focusing on what parents want for their kids, even if it's not most likely to produce math achievement, for example. And existing studies of vouchers or ESAs, suggest that math achievement is probably not going to be maximized through these programs. And the best knowledge we have, I hope it's different because we're implementing them at scale. How do we think about that trade-off between, and perhaps you don't see a trade-off, but between pushing forward achievement, but also in most of these states, there's actually no way for us to even track the achievement gap because there aren't tests that are being, required for all families. And of course, some states do require that. I just love to hear you jam out a little bit on that.
Yeah. You want to?
So I guess I'll start with turn on the mic. So first of all, I believe there's only one state that does not test for achievement, that's Arizona. But if you know of others, let's talk about that. And that's because most states have said we need transparency for the families, if not for the people who are researching this. I'm pro-research. I'm always interested in what the research studies are telling us. The couple of examples you point to where there's been some either neutral or even negative impact from participating, those to me are worth studying because it tells us where we might be getting our design wrong, and we can fix those designs. These are public policy questions, and so I would ask you to contrast that with our current system. We have lots of data. We see children fail. We knew for years that the science of reading was the superior approach to literacy, and the system ignored it, again, for political reasons. So having a system of choice competition allows people to say, your kid's not going to learn to read if you go to that school. They will learn to read if they come to my school, and create some tension with the providers, the status quo, who doesn't want to change anything about what they've done because of their own adult interests.
Yeah, and I think that school choice is a really wonderful issue to kind of hone in on here, because I think it's a wonderful public policy issue to debate and discuss. There's a lot of research and evidence that can be brought to bear, a lot of different flavors and varietals of what choice might look like. I've worked for 2 presidents, one which was a big supporter of choice. And in fact, and when I was in the White House, we probably doubled the amount of charter schools that were funded, public charter schools that were funded with federal dollars. And I've also worked for a president who was less fond of public charter schools in President Biden. So I think there's always been this. I come from a time when there was a strong bipartisan support for accountability, and for regardless of the school that you're going to, whether it's a public charter school or a traditional school, that there would be a level of accountability for all students. It's puzzling to me why we have trends that are now advocating to undo that accountability or to not assess the progress of our students in certain federally funded or publicly funded settings, because I worry that does, and Jim is much more versed on the choice work than I am. So, I think his point is that's not widespread. That's maybe only in Arizona, but I do think we are starting to see places say, well, we want to just have a voucher. We don't want to have any assessment or accountability attached to that voucher. I think we've looked at the data around whether vouchers work in terms of improving student achievement, and in some of the places like Washington DC that have had a large scale voucher program, it's pretty conclusive that achievement is not increased as a result of that voucher. And when we look at that as a trade-off from a policy perspective on other interventions, like improving low performing schools, like providing high quality coaching and high quality instructional materials in those schools, providing individualized intervention for students, providing opportunities for mental health and wraparound services for students. We find that like a lot of those things have a bigger impact and effect on student well-being and student academic success than merely an unaccountable private school voucher. So I just don't know why we would keep investing here when we can invest smarter here.
Can I just follow up here, because the DC results that you're talking about actually make my point. It is not a program at scale. It serves about 1,500 very low income families who made the choice that they prefer to go often to a local K, they're not in high school, or they're often faith-based institutions, and they're doing it at the cost of what the charter schools, which isn't at scale, it's more than 50%, I think, of students
That's
in Washington DC. So to me, that raises questions about how much should we fund a scholarship? Do we give it literally one half of what we gave the charter school? Charter schools, by the way, only get 70% what the traditional system gets. So there's just fundamental questions about money following children to whatever choice they have. And I always want to respect families' decisions. And I have a real problem with the compulsory nature of, because you live in this neighborhood, you have to go to this school, even though you know it's not going to work for your child.
And I will just to reflect on that, and I appreciate it. The voucher program in DC is not at scale. It is a long-standing program. It was created by Speaker Boehner years ago. So it's one that we can study because it's been in a public setting and system for quite some time. But I think where we probably find some area of agreement here is around the importance of parental choice. And I think if you look at the evidence, I'm not sure that you're going to see voucher students outperforming other students by virtue of giving that family a voucher. And in fact, in a lot of places, that voucher doesn't nearly cover the cost of a high quality private school, right? But I do think parents need greater choices in public education. And, whether that's public charter schools, whether that's, some of the open enrollment policies that we're seeing in other districts. Some districts are doing inter-district school choice, right, where students have options to go and parents have options to choose among public education in other parts of the city or other parts. I do think we need to do a better job of listening to parent voice in the public education enterprise than we have been doing before. And I think I believe there's a compelling policy reason and policy rationale to do that in public education.
So so that you understand, because I do follow this research, the overwhelming results are that this is actually beneficial to have choice. It not only improves the achievement of the participants, but also there is a competitive effect that helps all schools improve around them. So that's we often talk about the handful of studies where there's been a problem, and that's what I was talking about. Like, we should look at those studies too and make sure they get the lessons from
public school choice.
Well, what I was talking about was actually the study of private schools.
Yes.
But charter schools, the same thing, where we've watched. First of all, the charter school community has increased its performance over time. I happen to be at the Walton Family Foundation when Credo, the Stanford, when they wanted to do these studies, and we funded them, and it turned out that there were a lot of cases where charters were not outperforming the traditional school. In fact, it was a U-shaped, the opposite of the bell curve. A lot of people on the low end, a lot of people on the high end. And over time, what we've watched is that the charter school has now more of a bell curve that skews toward higher performance. So there's something else, the point there is that there's something about self-improvement in the charter school sector that we do not see in traditional schools. And again, my theory is that's because it's a monopoly and there's not the incentives to get better.
We could go on this for.
That would be the finish of on school choice, and we'll continue this conversation.
good.
But we'd like to give our audience the opportunity to ask some questions as well. And so tell me what the protocol is for how we tend to do this. Students first, I love it.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for coming here and talking. It's really awesome to hear from you guys. So my question is about, you talked about how like test scores are dropping and literacy levels are dropping. Has there been like, maybe it's not due to poor education, but less modernized education? Like growing up, when I was bored, I had to hang out with the Magic Tree House and stuff like that. And these days, it's like tablets and stuff like that. So has there been thought and like research into like addressing like the changing children as opposed to trying to fix maybe just an old education system?
The emerging research is that there is something fundamental that has happened here, and it coincides with screen and the use of screen. So we think your hypothesis is correct. A lot of researchers are looking at exactly that issue. And again, our system is not nimble in responding to it in a way that actually improves student achievement. That much we can tell. They're moving that direction. I have to say that one thing good, the successful public policies usually have, you cannot do something anymore. They can't do proof in a lot of countries, if you understand reading systems. But they're just saying no phones, no screens between 9 and the bell. And again, there's a trade-off because for a long time, that's where students were learning from their screens. And so there's having to be an adjustment away from them.
Yeah, I'd also just make sure we draw the distinction here. Well, a couple of things. One is it is still a hypothesis, right? So I do think we need further study, on impact of screen time and on the impact of that in students' learning and lives. No phones is one thing, no screen time, and I will just say, like, this is blunt policy. We're seeing a number of states right now that are actually debating in some passing state laws that eliminate screen use in schools. We are a nation and we're in an era of the use of educational technology, especially for our students with disabilities who rely on assistive technologies to be able to be successful. But I would say for all kids, some use of technology in how they think about their learning in their lives, I would argue can be, if it's used the right way. There are a lot of examples of effective use and effective application of technology in schools. I kind of set that apart from the cell phone use policies, which I personally think make a lot of sense for a lot of schools. So like it's, the cell phone is, and the opportunity need to kind of the distracting mechanism of that is interfering with education. That aside, I think there's a lot of evidence around what does work to improve reading and math achievement. And we just need to do more of that. Even as we're seeing some of the attention span and some of the very harmful effects that have been chronicled around social media. We have to address those things, but that should not remove the imperative of needing to implement better curriculum and better techniques for our students to be able to learn.
Can I amplify this point? Because as I look across the country with all these state legislators saying no phones anymore, they talk as if it's going to fix the problem.
Yeah.
And it simply won't. We have all this other fundamental stuff to.
Hello, I'm Jackie. Thank you so much for speaking. I feel like I've already learned a lot from your brief conversation. I wanted to ask about teachers, which we haven't really talked about. I have the sense that teacher unions are very powerful across the country, but then also I hear anecdotally that teachers are always overworked and underpaid. Also, many people, my peers at Princeton, for example, don't really want to go into teaching, even if they're passionate, because they find the profession very overbearing and are scared of burnout as well as the low financial payout. So I'm wondering what you think about the problem, like what is the problem with especially public school teaching, charter or traditional, and what are solutions to address that?
I'll get us started on this.
You're right.
I would say, that teachers are underpaid first and foremost. Like, there's data that shows that teachers earn 74 cents on every dollar of their other college educated peers in comparable professions. So we have to do a better job of prioritizing a basic, I would argue, minimum wage for our teachers. That teachers should not have to drive Uber and balance 3 other jobs while they're teaching. And if we expect that and we let that be the norm for our society, then we're gonna have to pay the consequences of the teacher shortage that we're seeing right now and of the depressed interest in going into teaching. All you have to do is look around the world and find other places, whether it's Singapore or Finland or other places where teaching is a competitive profession, right? Where teachers are supported, not just with pay, because if you talk to teachers, the pay is not the only reason they want to leave. It's not the only reason, it's not the reason that they are, challenged in the profession, as much as we need to do better in raising that. But it's that they don't have the opportunities to learn and lead and grow and support and build a stronger education system the way they do in other countries where teachers are also researchers, where they have a diversified profession, where they're going, they're evaluating in low stakes environments their performance against others, they're giving feedback to their peers, they're instructional leaders, they're innovators, they're producers of evidence in ways that we have now figured out how to structure here in the US. I think one of the biggest challenges we have is we are a one-size-fits-all teaching country, right? We do not have differentiated roles or school structures or staffing structures that allow our most talented teachers to rise in the profession as leaders and mentor, support, and deliver professional learning and professional development, or shape the policies, curricular decisions, and procedures at the school level. So as long as we limit the vision and the voices of our most talented teachers to the 4 walls of their classroom, we're going to keep getting what we're getting now. And we need to, I think, evolve pretty dramatically to restructure some of those roles so that we are recognizing our most talented teachers. A lot of the teachers that I worked with who were some of the most amazing instructional leaders I've seen, who've been in the classroom 14 years, have gotten great results with their kids. And we're just getting ready to leave because there was no professional career path for growth outside of becoming a principal or a district administrator. So I think we have to change that a bit if we're going to be able to get ahead.
So there's a lot of overlap in our positions here, but so I'll talk about the part that doesn't overlap. So first of all, as we look at it, it's a horrible job. I mean, I think there's a reason why a lot of people don't go into teaching is they look at what happens when you go into that factory and how you're really constrained from improving student achievement. So I think a lot of rational people say, well, if the system were different, I might do it. We also disagree about, we think the teacher union has been very successful raising total compensation for teachers. I live in California. Average teacher salary is close to $90,000. And remember, this isn't a full year salary, right? So often when they're doing these other jobs, it's because they're not in school. The school is out. The teacher contracts require 180 days a year. Most of us work 250, right? So you have to sort of adjust all of this. And that fits a lot of people's lifestyles, particularly your second income, for example. And you're now off it when the children are off from school. So there's a lot of The economic decisions, I don't think are what are causing the problems in recruitment, although the teacher unions want them. I think the real problems are they've created a job that is really difficult. Who would want it?
Hi, thank you both so much for being here, Professor Jennings for moderating. I am writing my thesis on enrollment burdens for public schools in New Jersey, and I won't belabor the point about immigration stuff and civil rights at the federal level because I think we already had that discussion. But I do want to ask about actually homelessness protections, and so actually this ended up being safe, but the Big Beautiful Bill did propose cutting funding for McKinney-Vento liaisons. And that was salvaged, but it does raise questions about, especially a world without a Department of Education, where those liaisons are not really going to fit in a Department of Justice, like what the role is for the federal government in that. So I'm wondering how you both see the role of the federal government in protecting people who are tenuously housed, and also those are often some of our lowest achieving students.
Yeah, nobody's talking about getting rid of McKinney-Vento. Just
Well, they proposed cutting the funding for it, the liaisons.
the big beautiful bill. I didn't know that. You'll notice that Congress did not cut it. The law will still be in place. I imagine what's going to happen there is it's going to move over to housing and urban development, which has a great deal of expertise in homelessness. That population, as you know, is very poorly served under the current system. And this is again where choice and competition between new options that do well. There's a charter school in Los Angeles that literally is a bus that goes around and picks up kids. And those are the kinds of more innovative, creative approaches.
And I would just say there's a reason we have McKinney-Vento, and it's because our homeless children and our children that are most vulnerable in their families were underserved without that law and without the infrastructure of homeless liaisons that are helping to support those families. And I've visited with some of those families even just recently about the challenges that they were facing, both under the beautiful bill, but also just in the administration's withholding of $6 billion this past year while they decided whether they wanted to continue to fund education or not. They eventually let some of that money go. But I worry about that. I think HUD is a place where that has expertise in housing. They don't have any expertise in education. They don't have the expertise that I think those families need and rely on to be able to wrangle districts and wrangle states to ensure that the requirements that are under Title I are adhered to so that those students have full access. There's a lot of districts that don't understand their requirements around McKinney-Vento, and as a result, kids don't get the transportation that they need. They don't get the opportunity to attend their home school that they started in, even if they're homeless and living outside of that school zone. And so it's the people at the Department of Education that help to answer those questions and enforce that law.
Thanks both for coming to speak. Teddy Knox, Master of Public Affairs student. You talked a bit about measurement and accountability and how it varies in a state context. It's relevant in a federal context too. The current Trump admin reduced the staff of the Institute of Education Sciences to almost zero and canceled a lot of contracts as well. Institute that responsible for a huge part of the research and data gathering. Why do they do that? Are those functions going to move somewhere else? Should it be rebuilt? Those discussed. Thank you.
Well, I have 5 areas where I think there's an appropriate federal role. One of them is in data collection. And I don't want you to mix that up with the accountability system. Those are 2 separate things. States are the entity that do the tests, decide what's going to be on their report card. My point about the latter, so hear me clearly, we need good data collection systems. They need to be faster, cheaper, and better than what we have today. And hopefully the phoenix that comes out of the ashes of IES, the Institute for Educational Science, will be much stronger. On the accountability system, I think we better start being honest with ourselves that it hasn't worked. We watched the political backlash to NCLB, the No Child Left Behind Act, where it was Roberto was mentioning, like, that was causing these small but important increases in student achievement. Political backlash, they reversed it all. Today, the only place where accountability systems are working is where the state leadership has said, this is important. The federal law plays almost no role, except as a vehicle for reform-minded state chiefs to say, the federal government made me do this, even though it's not making the other 49 states do it. So, does that get your answer? Yeah.
Yeah, as you'd expect, have a bit of a rosier picture around the importance of accountability and standards-based reform. I do think it's had its problems, right? I think and this is why Congress in 2015 corrected some of the problems with No Child Left Behind, particularly in how it narrowed curriculum and did not provide enough flexibility to states in how they formulate their accountability system. But the idea that every student should be part of that accountability system is important, right? And to be clear, like that is the law of the land in all 50 states today, only because Congress requires that. Before No Child Left Behind, 35 states did not include students with disabilities, English learners, or disaggregated data based on race in their accountability systems. And that was because we let them.
To be clear, I also believe in accountability systems. I think they should be managed at the state level. Prior to NCLB, we had great success in places like Texas, where the president came from, and California, where I
Massachusetts.
exactly. So these systems were, I'm saying, very difficult, if not impossible, to do it from the federal level.
Yeah. And then, on the evidence front and IES, I mean, this is an area where I think Jim and some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have been concerned or might share some of my arguments around the importance of rebuilding infrastructure. I hope that we can have a phoenix rise from the ashes because, our country needs rigorous data analysis, rigorous evaluation, and formulation to advance and disseminate evidence. IES was not perfect. It actually, I worked on the reauthorization in 2002, and Congress has not revisited it yet. It needs to. But to be clear, right now we have ashes. Like we have 19. We don't have 0, but we have 19 people in the Institute of Education Sciences. It used to be 190. $900 million was gone from contracts in that agency as a result of DOGE. The National Science Foundation, which also funds important STEM research, is down from $5 billion of that research to $750 million. So we are, as a result of the DOGE efforts, so we are going backwards with respect to our building of an infrastructure around educational sciences and education research. And I think we need to go in the opposite direction.
One more question? Okay.
The-
This is a fantastic conversation.